It all started on a Monday morning that I would never forget. Not because it was the beginning of another work week, but because it was a day my entire life took a turn I never saw coming. The air in the office felt heavier than usual. A silent warning I didn't heed until it was too late. I walked past the cubicles, pretending that everything was normal, forcing a smile at colleagues who barely looked up from their screens. But beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft tap-tap of keyboards, I felt a growing tension, like a storm waiting to explode. Weeks before, I had noticed subtle things about my boss, small behaviors that, on their own, seemed innocuous, almost forgivable. But patterns don't lie. The comments that skirted professional boundaries, the veiled threats in team meetings, the favoritism that punished hard work and rewarded fear, all added up. My instinct screamed that something was off, but rationalizing it seemed easier than confronting it. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe stress was clouding my judgment. But that Monday, a single interaction shattered that fragile denial. I was called into her office, the same office where I had laughed nervously at jokes that didn't deserve a laugh, where I had worked late nights polishing presentations for projects that were never acknowledged. The door closed behind me, the click echoing like a judge's gavel. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met mine, and I immediately knew this wasn't a routine check-in. She spoke softly at first, like a predator testing its prey, asking me questions about my work, about my colleagues, about things that didn't even make sense. I answered politely, trying to hide the creeping panic. Then it happened, a comment, subtle yet loaded with implication, a phrase designed to make me question my place, my value, my sanity. "You're too sensitive," she said. "Maybe this isn't the right environment for you." It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but this time it hit differently. It hit with the weight of a threat I couldn't ignore. I left her office with a tight knot in my stomach, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I had a choice: stay silent and risk being complicit, or speak up and risk losing everything. I decided to speak up. The courage I felt was a curious mix of fear and determination. I documented everything: emails, screenshots, voice notes, even notes from meetings where behavior crossed lines that should never have been crossed. I approached HR, explaining the situation in as calm a tone as I could muster. I expected hesitation, maybe bureaucracy, but I believed the truth would protect me. I left that meeting with a sense of cautious relief, thinking the hardest part was over. But reality doesn't always reward courage immediately. The next day, I was called in again. This time it wasn't about work. It was about me. She had already spoken to HR. Her demeanor was cold now, stripped of any pretense of professionalism. "We don't see a place for you here anymore," she said. The words hit like a hammer. Fired. Just like that. No negotiation, no discussion, just a termination that felt like punishment for daring to speak the truth. I tried to reason, to remind them of my contributions, of the evidence I presented, but it was futile. The system I had trusted protect me had turned its back. Walking out of that office, I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and profound betrayal. Colleagues whispered, some looking away, some offering quiet sympathy. I knew the rumor mill would start. The interpretations would twist, and the narrative would be rewritten without me. I felt small, vulnerable, exposed. But underneath the fear, a spark remained. If my voice could be silenced here, it wouldn't stay silent forever. Something inside me refused to accept that this was the end. Over the following weeks, the consequences of my firing rippled through my life. I struggled with bills, with self-doubt, with sleepless nights where my mind replayed every detail of that fateful meeting. But amidst the chaos, I noticed subtle shifts in the company. Whispers of complaints of other employees who had quietly endured similar treatment began surfacing. A pattern I had suspected alone suddenly became a thread connecting others' experiences. It was a thread I never planned to pull, but fate has a way of guiding your hand. I began reaching out cautiously to former colleagues, those I could trust. Their stories mirrored mine, each one adding weight to the truth I had tried to protect. Emails went unanswered, voices went silent, yet every piece of corroboration strengthened the sense that what I had risked everything to expose was real and bigger than I had imagined. And then came the call that made my heart race, a voice on the other end saying words that I had feared I would never hear. Someone had taken my evidence seriously, someone who had the power to change the narrative. It wasn't immediate vindication. The process was slow, bureaucratic, grueling. I felt the temptation to give up, to resign myself to being a cautionary tale whispered in office corners. But each time I considered letting go, I thought of the others who hadn't dared speak. I thought of the principle that had forced me to act in the first place. I realized that truth isn't always loud, isn't always celebrated. It often hides in shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. And just when I thought the walls around me would never crumble, cracks began to appear. Evidence that had been dismissed, overlooked, even ignored, started surfacing in ways that couldn't be denied. Colleagues who had stayed silent out of fear now whispered their confirmations. Emails, recordings, notes, all pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture far different from the one my former boss had tried to sell. The more I saw, the more I realized that what it felt like the end of my career was actually the beginning of exposing a truth that couldn't be buried forever. The days that followed my firing felt like being trapped underwater, gasping for air that refused to come. I tried to occupy myself, scrolling through job postings, forcing smiles at friends who asked how I was. But every interaction felt hollow. Every notification on my phone made my heart race with hope or dread, and most of the time, it was dread. The weight of injustice pressed down, reminding me that my life had been upended simply because I had chosen honesty over silence. But then, small cracks in the armor of my former workplace began to appear. At first, it was subtle. A colleague's message sent through an encrypted app, hinting that others had seen what I had documented. Then, more people reached out, sharing details of harassment, favoritism, and intimidation that mirrored my own experience. Reading their messages, I realized I hadn't been alone, that my voice wasn't an isolated scream in a void. The sense of isolation that had haunted me began to transform into a cautious determination. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person who had been silenced. I decided to approach the situation strategically. Every piece of evidence I had gathered, emails, screenshots, recordings, notes, needed to be organized meticulously. I couldn't afford mistakes. One misstep could discredit everything. I created a timeline, documenting every interaction, every comment, every instance of behavior that crossed professional boundaries. The process was exhausting, emotionally draining, and terrifying. Every time I compiled another folder, I relived the humiliation, the fear, the hopelessness I had felt on the day I was fired. But the thought of turning this into justice kept me moving forward. Meanwhile, the office I had been forced to leave was already trying to rewrite the narrative. Rumors began circulating, some subtle, some blatant, painting me as unstable, difficult, or unprofessional. I knew how damaging that could be if left unchecked. So I maintained meticulous records of everything, anticipating that the fight for truth will require not only courage, but evidence that could not be ignored. My mind became a battlefield between despair and resolve, but I clung to the latter, realizing that perseverance was my only weapon. Weeks turned into months. Each time I thought the process might stall, a new piece of information arrived. A manager from another department admitted to having witnessed the same behavior. An HR representative, speaking anonymously, hinted that my claims had caused internal investigations. The tide was shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was shifting nonetheless. I began to feel the first flickers of vindication. Not the vindication that heals wounds instantly, but the kind that promises that injustice is not absolute. Then came the tipping point. An internal audit, triggered by unrelated complaints, uncovered a pattern of behavior that directly validated everything I had reported. Emails that had been dismissed, notes that had been overlooked, all of it painted a picture of a workplace culture that was toxic at the top. My heart pounded as I read through the reports, each page confirming that the nightmare I had endured was real, that I had not imagined it, that I had not overreacted. The truth I had risked everything to uphold was finally taking shape outside my own perspective. I was careful, though I didn't announce it to the world immediately. I wanted the process to be bulletproof, undeniable, documented beyond any shadow of doubt. I reached out to the people I trusted most, those who had supported me in silence, asking them to prepare statements. Each message I received, each affirmation from someone who had seen the truth firsthand, strengthened the foundation for what was coming. My fear remained. After all, corporate cover-ups are resilient. But hope began to seep in like sunlight through storm clouds. And then, just when I started to believe that maybe justice could be achieved, a confrontation loomed. The company, sensing the shift in power, attempted to preemptively discredit me, reaching out to colleagues and questioning my credibility. It was a moment that could have destroyed everything. But the preparation, the meticulous evidence, the corroborating testimonies, they held firm. Each attempt to twist a narrative back in favor of my former boss failed, because the truth had a weight that lies could never match. What struck me most during this period wasn't just a vindication. It was the ripple effect. Other employees who had endured the same behavior began coming forward, encouraged by the knowledge that I hadn't been silenced. The office, once a place of fear and manipulation, was starting to crack under the pressure of its own secrets. It was surreal to witness the transformation, to realize that by standing up for myself, I had unknowingly opened the door for others to reclaim their voices. And yet, the process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, dead ends, people unwilling to speak, evidence dismissed temporarily, but each obstacle reinforced my resolve. I realized that truth is rarely fast or easy. It is patient, stubborn, and relentless. With every rejection, I documented more carefully, corroborated more thoroughly, and fortified my case. I learned that courage isn't a single act. It's persistence, day after day, even when the odds seem insurmountable. By the end of this chapter, months after being fired, I had transformed. I wasn't the same person who had walked out of that office in shock and humiliation. I had become methodical, focused, determined to see justice served. And though the final outcome was still on the horizon, the sense that truth was unstoppable became my guiding force. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I could feel the scales beginning to tip in my favor. The day I had been dreading and hoping for at the same time finally arrived. I was contacted by an external investigator brought in to review the internal findings. Their questions were precise, direct, and thorough. I recounted every detail, the dismissive comments, the threats, the favoritism, the subtle undermining that had eroded my confidence and professional standing. Each word fell heavy, as if the weight of months of fear, doubt, and injustice rested on my shoulders. But unlike before, I wasn't trembling. I was prepared. I was armed with evidence. I was ready for the truth to surface. The investigation didn't happen in isolation. Anonymous complaints from other employees started lining up, each one echoing the same patterns I had reported. The accounts of humiliation, intimidation, and manipulative behavior formed a dam that could no longer hold back the flood of truth. It was surreal. People who had once hidden in silence now stepped forward cautiously, some fearful of repercussions, others desperate to reclaim their voices. I realized that what had started as my personal fight had grown into a collective reckoning, one that no single person could ignore. Then came the day I was invited to a formal meeting with HR and the investigator present. My former boss was there too, attempting to maintain an air of authority. Though the tension in her posture betrayed her, I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of fear, the awareness that the ground beneath her was shifting. She tried to speak first, offering rehearsed explanations and denials, but the investigator held firm, cutting through the evasions with precise questions. I stayed silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. And it did. Emails, notes, recordings, all pointing to behaviors that could no longer be denied or minimized. The room felt electric. Every statement, every corroborating piece of evidence, chipped away at the carefully constructed facade that had protected her for so long. My pulse raced, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. The truth I had fought to uphold was finally visible to others, tangible the evidence that left no room for interpretation. I could feel the weight of vindication settling over me, but I also recognized the responsibility it carried. This was no longer about me. It was about justice, about accountability, about preventing others from suffering in silence. By the end of that meeting, the investigators summarized their findings. My boss's behavior was not only inappropriate, but it created a toxic work environment. The implications were serious: formal reprimands, potential legal consequences, and, for the first time, recognition of my reports as accurate and credible. I felt a wave of relief so intense that it almost brought me to tears. It wasn't just about being believed. It was about seeing the truth validated in a way that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. News of the findings spread slowly but inevitably through the company. Colleagues who had once been cautious now spoke openly about their experiences. The culture of fear began to unravel, replaced by cautious optimism. I watched from the sidelines, knowing I had sparked this change by refusing to stay silent. The transformation was subtle at first: a manager acknowledging past mistakes, HR implementing new reporting systems, employees feeling safer to voice concerns, but it was real, tangible, undeniable. Even outside the office, the impact was profound. My reputation, which had been at risk due to the termination and rumors, began to recover. Former colleagues reached out to apologize, to express solidarity, to thank me for taking a stand. I realized that the cost I'd paid, months of uncertainty, anxiety, and financial strain, was now being offset by a sense of purpose and accomplishment that no one could take away. My decision to speak up had not only vindicated me, but had created a ripple effect that reached far beyond my own experience. Yet, even as the truth emerged, I remained vigilant. I knew that systems of power often resist change, and that accountability is rarely permanent without continued attention. I stayed connected with those who had supported me, offering guidance, encouragement, and advice to anyone facing similar challenges. I became an advocate not out of ego, but out of necessity, a commitment to ensure that silence would never again be the default response to injustice in that office. Reflecting on the months of struggle, I understood something profound. Courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about acting despite it, about choosing integrity over convenience, truth over safety. The firing that once felt like an endpoint was, in reality, the catalyst for change, both within the company and within myself. I had walked through the worst professional experience of my life and emerged stronger, more aware, and deeply committed to the principle that no one should have to suffer in silence. By the time the investigation concluded, my former boss had been formally disciplined, and systemic changes were implemented to prevent future abuses. The truth had not only come out, it had forced action, accountability, and recognition of the harm caused. For the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of closure. I had not just survived. I had reshaped the narrative, reclaimed my voice, and inspired others to do the same. And yet, closure didn't erase the memory of fear, betrayal, or uncertainty. It didn't erase the weeks of anxiety, the sleepless nights, or the financial strain, but it transformed them into lessons about resilience, integrity, and the power of speaking truth to authority. I realized that life doesn't guarantee fairness, but it does reward those who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. The experience had left scars, yes, but it also left me with a sense of empowerment and a deep understanding of what it truly means to stand up for yourself. After the investigation concluded, the world felt different. The office I had once feared now seemed almost unrecognizable. Conversations carried a new honesty, one that had been suppressed for far too long. Employees walked with a lighter step. Managers were more accountable, and the atmosphere, once tense and toxic, began to feel cautiously hopeful. It was surreal to witness this transformation, one that I had thought impossible when I was staring at the pink slip in my hand months earlier. I had been at my lowest, humiliated and uncertain, yet somehow the consequences of standing up had rippled outward, creating change far beyond my own experience. I spent the following weeks reflecting, connecting the dots of the months I had lived through, the firing, the isolation, the anxiety. It had all been part of a larger story, a crucible that had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every sleepless night, every second of fear, every moment of self-doubt now felt purposeful. I realized that courage isn't a single act. It's a series of choices made even when the odds are stacked against you. And those choices, small and large, build momentum that can shift the course of lives, workplaces, and even entire systems of power. As the months went on, I found myself being approached by people outside the company, friends, former colleagues, even strangers, seeking advice on how to navigate situations where speaking up felt risky. I became an unofficial mentor, Not because I sought recognition, but because I understood, in a way few do, what it takes to reclaim your voice against impossible odds. The experience had transformed me from someone who feared confrontation into someone who saw accountability not as a threat, but as a responsibility. It was empowering in a way that no promotion or paycheck could ever replicate. There were moments, of course, when the scars of that time resurfaced. I'd catch myself doubting whether I had done enough, questioning whether every decision I had made was correct. But then I would remember the small victories. Colleagues now speaking freely, policies being enforced that had once been ignored, my own ability to face fear without flinching. And I understood that the measure of courage isn't in perfection, it's in persistence. The persistence to speak truth, to uphold integrity, to continue fighting even when the world seems determined to silence you. I also realized that the fallout of standing up for myself didn't just affect me professionally. It changed my relationships, reshaped my priorities, and clarified what truly mattered. I no longer wasted energy on superficial office politics or on people who sought to intimidate rather than collaborate. My focus shifted toward building environments where honesty, respect, and accountability weren't just buzzwords, but tangible expectations. I discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed, and with it, a clarity that has guided every decision I've made since. Looking back, I understand that being fired was both a punishment and a catalyst. It was a moment that forced me to confront injustice directly, to organize, to document, and to persist even when it felt easier to give up. And in that crucible, I learned that the truth has a power far greater than fear, greater than intimidation, greater than the false narratives that people sometimes try to impose. The truth, when pursued relentlessly, cannot remain buried. It has a way of emerging, of demanding recognition, and of creating change that lasts long after the initial battle is over. In the aftermath, my former boss faced consequences that were long overdue. The company implemented structural changes to protect employees from abuse, to encourage transparency, and to prevent fear from dictating behavior. And while the damage caused by our actions could never be entirely undone, the system had finally shifted in a way that rewarded honesty, courage, and integrity. I realize that justice isn't always immediate, and it's rarely clean, but it is possible, especially when individuals refuse to stay silent. Most importantly, I came to understand the value of my own voice. Speaking up was terrifying, but the alternative, silence, would have meant complicity in a culture that punished honesty and rewarded fear. I had discovered a power I hadn't recognized before, the ability to influence, to inspire, and to create accountability through courage. And that power is not limited to me. It belongs to anyone willing to stand up, document carefully, and insist on truth. The journey was painful, uncertain, and exhausting. But as I moved forward, I carried the knowledge that adversity can illuminate character, that speaking truth has consequences but also rewards, and that even in moments of profound fear, persistence can carve a path toward justice. My life has changed, not because the fire defined me, but because my response to it revealed a strength I didn't know existed. And now, every time I reflect on that experience, I see not just the injustice, but the triumph that emerged from it. If you've ever felt powerless in a situation that seemed unfair, remember this. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Truth isn't always immediate. Change doesn't happen overnight. But standing up, documenting, persisting, you become the spark that can ignite the fire of accountability. And that fire, it has the power to transform not just your story, but the stories of everyone around you. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe and join me in uncovering truths that others are too afraid to speak. Here, we shine light on what's hidden, celebrate courage, and remind each other that voices matter, even when the world tries to silence them. Don't just watch, be part of the change.